Good morning. In this morning's In Conversation, Richard will find out a little bit more about one of our well-known and popular local residents, Chris Herbert. Chris has dedicated much of his life to the church, where he has helped to shape and support communities. Chris will tell us all about his life, his career, and his relationship with Farnham. Over to you, Richard.
Michelle, thank you. Well, I'm delighted to be joined this morning for this conversation by the Right Reverend Dr. Christopher Herbert. I presume I can call you Chris.
Absolutely, Richard.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, as was explained, these are a series of In Conversations we're doing, and part of trying to bring Farnham to life through stories and the personalities. And you certainly have a story. I know you grew up in Gloucestershire and school in Monmouth,
Yeah.
and I was interested to see that your father helped run the transport business. Well, my background's transport as well, so that gets us off to a good start. But you didn't go in that direction, did you? Something
No,
quite.
no, I didn't. My father and his brothers, they ran a small haulage, what was in those days called a haulage business, now probably called logistics or something.
Oh, yes.
largely based, in fact, entirely based within the Forest of Dean. They were in the timber business, and their job was to collect timber from the woods, take it to what was called the chemical works in a little area called Canop, where the wood was burnt in retorts and where they made charcoal. And then various chemicals were distilled off, and they were left with what would now be barbecue fuel, but it wasn't. Yeah, so that was what my father trained as an iron molder, and he was enormously proud of that.
What, in Gloucestershire?
In Gloucestershire, in the Forest of Dean, where his uncle and his uncle and another man ran a small foundry. It was called Herbert and Young. And if you go around Gloucestershire, this is a sad bit of my life, really. I look on the pavements for manhole covers. And if I see a Herbert and Young manhole cover, I think, yeah, a bit of my DNA's in there.
You're going to get me starting to look for those now, you know.
So it's rather sad. I don't do it anywhere else, I promise you.
Right. But your first real sort of interest that comes through was education and training as a teacher. And
Yes.
So that was in parallel to your move towards the ministry, presumably.
It was, yeah. I was very, very lucky. Quick CV, school at Monmouth, that was wonderful. I was a day boy. Monmouth was a haberdasher school. In those days, direct grant. Went from there to Lampeter, was part of the University of Wales, now back under its own steam. Then went to Wells Theological College, and my college principal, very, very far-sighted man, said, I think the time will come when clergy won't be paid for their work. I think the financial pressures are going to be huge. So if you haven't got a professional qualification, you ought to get one. And he very generously, really generously, lent me his car to drive to Bristol to the university every day from Wells, PGCE. And then having done that, and I met my wife in Bristol, so that was an absolute bonus. And having done that, he then said, right, you better find a parish which is looking to use your educational skills as well as your clerical skills. So I ended up and I loved it. I was a curate in a parish in Hereford.
Yeah, lovely.
Yeah, beautiful, beautiful. And I was asked to be a teacher at what was then the Church of England Secondary Modern School, called the Bishop School. And I was also a local authority youth leader. So I ran 3 different youth clubs, did a half-time timetable, and the rest of the time I was a curate. So amazing.
Amazing. I mean, I looked briefly at your CV, and I guess the question that comes to mind if we move on a little is, what brought you to Farnham? Because I think you're a relatively long-term resident of Farnham, aren't you?
Yeah, relatively so. What brought me to Farnham? Well, I did a lot of educational work in Hereford diocese, but I always wanted to be a parish priest. I just wanted to be a vicar, and I thought I might get trapped in the world of education. Around, saw an advert in the Church Times for another parish in Guildford diocese. I didn't mind where I went in the country. It was pure chance that I ended up in Guildford. Looked at the parish and this wasn't the Bourne, and thought, no, that doesn't feel right. And at the end of the interview, the then Archdeacon said, why don't you want to take this job? And I explained, and I thought, well, that's the end of me in Guildford diocese. He said, I've got a place I want you to go and look at. Look at the Bourne.
Honesty, you see, transparency in response to that question.
I was so lucky, Richard. I mean, that was pure chance, but, or providence, depends how you look at it.
So the Bourne was actually your first, I was going to say priest role, I meant parish role.
Yes, it was my job, my first job as a vicar. Sorry.
And this is when you moved, obviously, to Farnham, but that was your first experience of Farnham, presumably, was
Absolutely. Didn't know Farnham, knew nothing about it, except, here's a curious little oddity. At school at Monmouth, in my class, was a boy called Michael Elphick.
No.
Yes. And he was, sadly, the late Alan Elphick's brother, Maurice Elphick's son. How he came to be in Monmouth, I don't know, but Michael Elphick was in my class.
Well, goodness me, it must have been in the stars, or whatever else you want to choose.
Absolutely.
What was your first impression of Farnham when you arrived?
Oh, I felt I'd come home.
Really?
Yeah, really. Because all my genetic background is the Welsh borders, Hereford, Gloucestershire, Forest of Dean, Monmouth, Abergavenny, that sort of area. And the minute I came to Farnham, gosh, I've come home. Very strange. I can't explain why, but certainly when I came into the Bourne Church, I just stood and looked, thought, well, this is it. Never been here before, knew nothing about it, but lucky me. Wonderful. Yeah.
And was it the impression, I mean, it's interesting, people say when they walk into a property, don't they, that, it feels right immediately, the alternative. When you walked into the Bourne Church, that being your first role as a parish vicar, I think you're implying you had the same feeling. The fit was good.
Oh, absolutely. And I couldn't describe why, Richard. Then I met the then church wardens, a lovely, lovely two men, one called Bill Rowlands, who was in banking, and another called John Seddon. And John,
it's my dog.
Your dog. I better explain, I haven't got a dog. He's objecting.
He's been shooed out.
Yeah, sure. I met John Seddon, wonderful man, professor of aeronautics, worked at RAE, great cricketer, and a brilliant, brilliant musician. I mean, the closest thing, dead now, alas, but, like a polymath. So conversations with him were amazing. And they took a punt on me because I'd never been a vicar before. And
it's quite a significant parish in terms of scale, isn't it?
It is. I didn't know it at the time, but it is. My predecessor was Paul Barber, alas, just recently died. And it's always had a reputation of being a very fine parish, which it most certainly is and remains. And I help out there now,
I know. Yeah.
Cutting the grass to preaching.
You mentioned polymath. I think that's something slightly different. But,
yes.
And clearly it comes across, Chris, that you enjoyed your time, both the fit into Farnham and the Bourne. But you were there, what?
9 years. 9 years. Yeah.
I was interested to sort of read the career ladder. In your world here, doesn't look dissimilar to many others, but you obviously had a tap on the shoulder and were asked to go and work in Guildford. You stayed in Farnham in that role, presumably, did you?
Well, two things happened. Firstly, whilst I was vicar of the Bourne, I was asked if I would head up what in those days was called post-ordination training. In other words,
Yeah.
would come to me and I'd do some tutorials and things with them. And then the then bishop, a man called Michael Adey, gorgeous, gorgeous man, he said to me, basically, I want you to be the Archdeacon of Dorking. So, you know, you get the tap on the shoulder from the bishop who says, and you just, if he says he wants you, you go and do it, really. So I was Archdeacon for 5 years in this diocese, lived in Woking, which I enjoyed very, very much, actually. And the only trouble with that job was that I served on 40 committees.
Oh, goodness me.
Both in the diocese and nationally. I did quite a bit nationally. And then the tap on the shoulder, and that was, we want you to be Bishop of St Albans.
I mean, so looking at this, you know, you come from the education field in the broadest sense, but your focus from Herefordshire area into your first parish as Vicar of the Bourne, step to Dorking, and then to Bishop of St Albans. Now that's what we might call quite a quick rise.
It was, I suppose it was. I was at one stage in Hereford, I was the youngest prebendary, that is canon, in the Church of England. So I'm just very, very lucky. I've had, you know, you don't get a calling into the church for money. I don't know what it is, but if you have a vocation, then you follow it. And followed what I thought was a calling. And it's been an utterly astonishing life. I wouldn't have missed a single moment of it.
Well, we'll get on to some of the other of your interests later. But I'm interested to compare St Albans, and I'm focused on Farnham, obviously. But you know, St Albans is a city, of course, isn't it? I mean, it was granted city status, I think, in the Victorian era. So how would you compare, you know, the environment, a place to live like St Albans with what we have here in Farnham?
Right. Well, the population of St Albans is, of course, much larger than Farnham, roughly 140,000 people, whereas Farnham is roughly 40,000. So it's 100,000 more people, much closer into London. So it's a 25-minute train journey to London. So it's much more commuter-based. St Albans, of course, has amazing Roman remains, amphitheatres and things, and it's got the Abbey, which became a cathedral in the Victorian era. And that makes an incredible difference. Same problem in Farnham, in St Albans, traffic. Traffic. And because St Albans is so close into London, you've got the M1 coming down one side, you've got the N25 south of St Albans, and if there's any problem on those roads, then the whole of St Albans, you know, grinds to a halt. Well, we don't have that in Farnham to quite the same extent. No motorways quite as near as that.
Well, we know the whole traffic scenario is one of the hot topics currently.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And I was interested to see that actually some of the other things that many places are grappling with, like the hollowing out of the town centre, that actually the cathedral area in St Albans is having some challenges with its retail area as well.
Absolutely.
So even somewhere like St Albans, with its history and its cathedral, is facing the same thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I noticed only the other day what they're also doing is having another look at their street market, because every week there's a very, very big market in St Albans. Apparently it's losing money, and they're now talking about putting up different structures. In fact, historically, the actual city centre shape of St Albans was based around a market and around market stalls, and then market stalls became shops, shops became houses. So it's struggling with its retail, like everywhere.
No, I mean it is, and I think we're going to see that challenge, you know, become more and more dominant aren't we?
Absolutely.
I was up
Absolutely.
in Wigan about a year ago. We think we have the problem here, but you go to somewhere like Wigan
Yeah,
or Derby, and
sure.
it's a bit further ahead. But look, tell me about being a bishop, because I've never had the opportunity of asking a bishop.
Right. Okay.
What's the key element of that role?
Well, I think the key element is to look after the clergy and the people of the diocese. If I give you some sort of figures off the top of my head, St Albans diocese was in all senses twice the size of Guildford diocese. So it had twice the number of churches, twice the number of clergy. It included the whole of Bedfordshire, the whole of Hertfordshire, a tiny bit of North London, fractions of Cambridgeshire and Buckinghamshire. So, but therefore, you can't micromanage. You simply can't, and nor should a bishop micromanage. You have to say, who are the key people in this area for whom I have a responsibility? Answer, leadership provided by the clergy. Therefore, my main task is to support the clergy and church wardens and lay readers in the work they do. And I tried to do that in a variety of ways, but I think that was absolutely key, because I think if bishops try to micromanage, do everything, you're finished, can't be done. You have to rely on your local people.
Am I simplifying to say there's a large element of that role that's a management role? Fundamentally, you've got a team,
Yeah.
you're looking after them in that career sense.
Yes,
But a lot of
absolutely.
your time must have been what we would understand as the management of the diocese.
Yes, it wasn't a huge proportion of my time, but let's give another sort of financial example. Every year in St Albans, we had to raise money on the plate. We had to raise £24 million every year. That was money on the plate. People coming to church, putting money in the plate. Half of that went to the church commissioners, then came back to pay the clergy. The other half stayed in parishes to do things like repair the church organ, pay for maintenance of the building. So, but it was 24 million a year. But you can't do that as on your own. You have to do that through your people. And there was the equivalent of a company secretary. I had 2 assistant bishops and 3 archdeacons, and it was their job to do more of the management, because as a diocesan bishop, it was a wonderful role. You made relationships with the leaders in society, civic society, commercial society, in Hertfordshire and Bedfordshire. So for instance, I would go to Smith Klein, or I would meet regularly with the chief constable, I'd meet with the senior fire officers, ambulance service. So you had a kind of overarching civic and communal role, as well as managing the church. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I was going to use the word civic in the way that you've described
Yeah.
it. And what a broad environment you had, from, I guess, Luton on the one hand and Dunstable, to, I know because I lived in Woburn for many years, sort of Woburn and Bedford. It's a very different sort of
Very
patch.
different, very different. I made the mistake, Richard, when I went there, thinking that St Albans Diocese would be Guildford Diocese north of the river. Couldn't be further from the truth. Totally different. What made it different? Well, it's a different part of the world. You've mentioned Luton, which is essentially an East Midlands industrial town that's kind of moved a bit south. Hertfordshire itself, amazing county, very small, but it had 5 new towns in the 20th century, 5. So places like Stevenage and Welwyn Garden City and so on.
Yeah.
And then Bedfordshire struggled and continues to struggle a bit by being caught between Cambridge on one side, which is absolutely burgeoning, Milton Keynes on the other. It described itself as at the centre of the Oxford-Cambridge arc.
Oh, I know. I remember there was this great plan to actually have a railway line reopened between Oxford and Cambridge. And at one point, digging a new canal. Did you?
Yeah.
I mean, this is going back to the early 2000s, I remember.
Yeah. I mean, I loved it there. So because the counties were very different. Very,
Yeah.
yeah.
Now, in that role, I mean, it was the second largest Roman town, I think, in
Yeah.
Roman times after
Yeah.
Londinium. But of course, you entered the House of Lords in 1999.
Yeah.
I was going to say presumably, I will not presume, but as Bishop of St Albans,
Yeah.
that was something that you were invited to do.
Yeah, what happened, the system, I used to refer to myself as the last lord of the millennium. It made me sound from Star Wars. Uh, what the system is, there are 25, or I think it's 25, 26 seats in the House of Lords for diocesan bishops. Now, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Archbishop of York, Bishop of Durham, Bishop of Winchester, they go in, and Bishop of London, they go in automatically.
Yeah.
The others, you go in as somebody retires at the top, you come in at the bottom, and you gradually move up until you become number 26, 25, 26, and then you enter the House of Lords. And there had been so many retirements just ahead of me that I then moved in quite rapidly. That's pure chance, and then spent 10 years there.
I think, you have a blameless background to have these things by chance, as you're describing them. I'm sure that's not the case. But tell me about your first impressions of the House of Lords. So we have Bishop of St Albans.
Yeah.
Now, I think it was 1999, was it?
1999.
Into the House of Lords.
Yeah. So you're summoned by the Queen to go into the House of Lords. So you turn up and meet Black Rod, and he takes you around Parliament. And I'd been there about once before, totally confusing. I couldn't get my bearings at all. And it so happened that I knew a man at Guildford Cathedral who worked in Parliament. And after I'd been taken around, I wasn't even shown where the loos were, it was just sort of taken around. I said to him, look, please just help me out. And he very kindly took me everywhere, from, showing me the loos, where the dining rooms were, etc., etc., etc. And I found the Lords, obviously, the privilege is immense. You keep bumping into people that, you've seen on the telly or you've read about, whatever.
Mm.
But you can't, well, first of all, there is a kind of particular ceremony where you're taken into the chamber of the House of Lords and you bow and you sign a parchment roll, which then gets put in the basement archives, and then you're in.
Mm.
As a bishop in the House of Lords, you have to wear your liturgical robe. So I wore what are called a rochet and shamir. And there are all sorts of unspoken rules. So you have to pick these up as you go along. Nobody gives you a list of rules. You just pick them up. Okay? It's a bit like I imagine, going to prep school.
Mm. Well, you must have felt a bit like the new boy in the big school.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely. But everybody going in, even if they're really experienced, been in the House of Commons, once they get to the Lords, everybody, it's different, totally different.
And what about speaking? And you became focused on health and ethics.
Yes.
Was that you deciding to pursue that as a particular interest? Because I know that ethics has been a feature of both your writing and your interest.
Yeah. Why did I get involved in that? Well, first of all, as a diocesan bishop, you're not only responsible for your diocese, you're usually given national responsibilities in some field or other. And I was asked if I would look after all the hospital chaplains throughout the country.
Oh, right.
So I did that and enjoyed that very, very much. That took me into the field of ethics. I'd done ethics at theological college and as part of my degree, but anyway, my first degree. So I became more and more interested, and of course, in the House of Lords, medical ethics comes in quite often.
Mm.
I was then invited to be a member of a select committee, which was an amazing experience, looking at the whole issue of euthanasia and assisted suicide.
Goodness.
And then I was asked if I would be the Church of England rep, as it were, talking with ministers about the Mental Capacity Act. And then I sat in on what in the Blair government's days was called a pre-legislative scrutiny committee, which was looking at the whole ethical bit around donor conception of children and so on.
Yeah.
And there was a clerk, here's a Farnham bit coming up. There was a clerk in that committee, and clerks in Parliament are very high status people. And I recognized her immediately as a young woman I'd known in Farnham. And she looked at me and I looked at her, and we just sort of said, gosh. And then she said, we better not recognize each other during the committee. So we spent the entire committee pretending we didn't know each other. And then when we had the wrap up of that committee several months later, she and I and the committee were sitting in the bar, and the chairman of the committee said, you seem to know Kate well. I said, absolutely, I've known her since she was 8. It was lovely.
I like to hear the stories, those human elements, such, you know, the red benches and the the paraphernalia, if I can put it like that. That's really good.
Yeah.
Now, when you retired as Bishop of St Albans, presumably you stepped down from the House of Lords. Is that how it works?
Yes, it is. Yeah.
Right. So retired, although I must say, looking at the amount of things you've been doing in quotes retirement, it sort of follows all the things that made you busy during your part of the career. But what brought you back to Farnham?
It's a very good question. We thought at one point we would go back to our genetic roots, Welsh borders. And we were driving up and down the M4 and thought, this is stupid. Whilst we love that part of the world, all our friends, all the people we know are in Farnham. And for Jan in particular, being a bishop's wife is really hard work and a complex job. It's a kind of bit of a gilded cage, really. And so she had taught at St Catherine's, Bramley, when we were here first time round. And she therefore had numbers of friends here. And I said to her, look, wherever we live, your choice this time. You followed me around. And she and I, between us, decided we would come back to Farnham, partly because my father-in-law had been in the Abbeyfield house in Shortheath Crest, as it then was, not there anymore. And I brought my mother from the forest to Anchorstone in Searle Road for the last couple of years of her life. So we had that to bring us back. So we bought a house, a flat along Shortheath Road, just as a kind of bolt hole when we were in St Albans. And then we thought, well, we'd buy something here just to keep our foot in the market. And then having been here, then having done that, our younger son and his wife and their now children arrived and said they were going to live in Farnham. So lucky old us. So we stayed and loved it.
So I guess that's a common story, isn't it? That, you know, family and friends, or maybe friends and therefore family bring you back.
Absolutely, Richard.
How do you think Farnham had changed in that time from when you first arrived to, and even then it's a little while ago.
Yeah, well, I came 40 years ago, and in those days, no traffic lights at the top of Firgrove Hill, Ridgeway Road. I mean, you know, you just sort of quietly crept across, and that's indicative. Traffic lights now, etc. So yes, traffic has increased, housing has increased. There have been some sad losses in my view. The Redgrave when we were here was on good form. I did a lot with Stephen Barry when he was director of the Redgrave. Used to take clergy there to be trained by him in theatre skills. What are the other changes? Well, I was lucky enough to live next door to Peter Drake Wilkes, and I therefore saw his work in the Maltings. And I think, my goodness me, the vision that he and Brigadier Will Anderson had to set that up, unbelievable.
In fact, as you look at things, and, you know, I've talked about, you know, trying to preserve, but not sort of put in aspect the heritage of Farnham, the Maltings is a real treasure now, and as is the Lion and Lamb Yard. And both of those things could have been lost, couldn't they?
Absolutely. No, I think they're both remarkable. And I think the Maltings especially And I think, Peter Drake Wilkes and Brigadier Anderson, well, I know Peter's name is on that little bridge from the Maltings across into the Wagon Yard. And that's lovely. It's how life goes. You do what you can and you move on or die. In Peter's case, he died. My gosh, I think his contribution and the contribution of Brigadier Anderson to the life of the town is something else, really.
Yeah. It's interesting because I'm going to have one of these conversations with Michael Marr, who actually has just taken over as chair at the Maltings.
Yeah.
But let me move you on to your personal interest, because I'm conscious of the time. I mean, literature, you've been a prolific author in your field.
Yeah.
I heard this week that the town council is hoping to run a literature festival in Farnham, which would be good.
That'd be fantastic. I think that'd be wonderful if they could do that. I think what I've been thinking, because you very generously sent me the questions earlier, I think one of the things what do I love about Farnham? I love the number of societies. I think things like the Arts Society, U3A, utterly brilliant, utterly brilliant. And I tell people when I'm away from here, what's going on, they can't believe it. And that's where the Maltings needs to remain as absolutely the center of ages. Fantastic. But I think there is a kind of gap in the middle. And I think the gap is that nobody quite champions Farnham. Farnham Society does, no question of that. You champion the architectural heritage and its history and all of that. Fabulous, absolutely wonderful. But where does the vision and the ideas come from to draw the town together? And I think one of the gaps in the town is what used to be the College of Art when I was here, now the university. And the links between the town and the university, in my view, are nothing like as strong and creative as they could be.
Well, I agree with you on that. And that's why we're a university town and a university of the creative arts, which must cheer you no end, given your interest in literature and art.
Yeah.
But it does feel a little separate too.
It does. And I would
feel
love
like a university town, does it?
No, it doesn't. And I would love to see that university vice chancellor say to the staff, look, why don't we run, for instance, a public lecture once a term? It doesn't necessarily have to be about art, but something which will establish much closer and warmer relationships. Because what I see around the town are lots of students internationally. Wonderful, lucky old us that they're here.
Great.
But there is somehow the energy in that university seems to be directed internally, and there appears not to be much looking out to say, how do we relate to Farnham? And I think there's so much more could be done if that were to happen.
Do you think the craft town status that we now have will be a good step forward to helping with that and creating that?
Absolutely. I think that's a remarkable status, and I'm very, very glad that it's happened. But I think we've got to build on it, Richard. We've got to build on that. And I think that will come when the university and the town, the council, Farnham Society, etc., somehow make a coherent kind of group that champions this. And I think I've been thinking a lot about it, really. Given the awfulness of this pandemic and given the way retail is to recover, if at all, I think two things likely to happen. I think retail, as we've known it, will struggle, sadly. I hope it, but I think it will. And secondly, I think more and more people will work from home, even if it's only 3 days a week rather than chuntering up to London or whatever. Now, the talent in Farnham is beyond belief. And that needs channeling and drawing together. But I don't know who does the drawing together of that talent.
I mean, one of the advantages of having so many societies is that it creates a richness.
Absolutely.
It maybe creates a separation because every
Yeah.
society has its own
That's right.
area of interest. So
Yeah.
I certainly take that point. It's
Yeah.
something we've discussed in the Farnham Society. Is there a role that we could play without treading on toes, of course,
Sure.
but to
Sure.
sort of be, you know, a hub in some
Yeah.
way?
But I think the Farnham Society, gosh, the town owes you a lot, Richard.
Well, I'm a recent
Well,
somebody involved.
you know
But
what I mean. I'm using you as the society as well as you as Richard.
yeah,
The town owes the society enormous gratitude for everything that has been done, the kind of hard work over against kind of Philistines, if I can put it like that.
yeah. Well, people
Society has done brilliantly.
people do put in a remarkable amount of time.
Yeah,
So it's
absolutely.
nice of you to say that. I want to end on this area, if I may.
Yeah,
And that is to go back to the church. The church
yeah,
during COVID, there's been lots of comments about
yeah,
it. But we've got a number, well, I was going to say a lot of churches in and
yeah,
around Farnham.
yeah.
So how do you judge the impact of COVID on the church and in particular our local churches?
Sure. Where do I start? I think we've been very fortunate. I can only speak really about the Bourne. I can't speak of many of the others. But the amount of work that the clergy, I exclude myself here, the clergy have put in to creating several things. First of all, Zoom services. Secondly, pre-recorded services. And those go out each Sunday. Meanwhile, there are or there is kind of the creation of networks of people who phone each other to make sure they're all right, etc. So the pastoral care has gone on down the phone or on Zoom. The services have continued to be held. Unfortunately, choirs have had to stop. So in the case of the Bourne, the choir, which is absolutely amazing, has not sung now for months and months and months, and probably won't be back for a while yet. So I think the churches, I know, for example, the Vicar of Hale has done a lot. I think the churches have continued to do everything they can. The Bourne will reopen on Palm Sunday. It's social distancing. But it's been a hard time, really hard for everybody. I mean, fortunately, nobody has lost their jobs, which is lucky. There have been people on furlough, which is very sad. I hope the churches will re-energize once we're out of lockdown and rediscover and recreate new ways of feeding their thinking into the life of the community. Churches withdraw from the community, Richard. We might as well, shut up shop and go home. We have stuck into the community and do everything we can.
Yeah. I mean, the church is the community, and hopefully, and in Farnham in particular, we've learnt better community spirit through actually something prompted by Gavin Stride at the Maltings, the Farnham Connect. So if I was to ask you to end on saying optimistic for the church's future because it's found new ways of engaging with the community, or the trends away from the church will grow as a result of COVID, on what side would you come down?
Gosh, Richard, that's a very interesting question. I don't write the church off at all. It's gone through, when you think of, put it in historic terms, the Black Death, Reformation, the Enlightenment, there's always been battering of the church. It will continue in various forms. I think what we shall learn from this lockdown in churches is we shall relearn, I hope, the importance of community. And by that, I don't mean just the people who go to church, wonderful though they are. They're amazing, amazing bunch of people. I think we shall relearn how to serve and work with and work alongside people in the community for the good of the whole community. That would be my hope, really, prayer, that out of this we can, as it were in Farnham, rediscover give thanks for the richness of the heritage, and then say, right, what are we going to do now collectively to ensure that the town's vibrancy, and especially those working from home, how do we ensure the vibrancy of people in Farnham is energized, channeled, used? I don't know how that will happen, but I look to the council and the university and the churches to see what we can do together.
I think that's a great moment for us to stop. I think we could have gone on for another hour about, because there's so much more in your background I'd like to explore.
Sure.
And maybe I could leave hanging out there a further invitation to do another of these.
Of course, be a pleasure, Richard.
But it's been very kind of you, Chris, for joining me in this conversation. Very interesting. And I'd like to, on behalf of the Farnham Society, thank you. Christopher Herbert, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Richard and Chris. A very interesting conversation. And I agree with your sentiments about the need for diversity and collaboration. The town really needs to develop its relationship with the UCA to bring together Farnham's rich mix of creative talent, help to forge a strong sense of place which builds on Farnham's uniqueness as a craft and market town.